Welcome to this week's lecture, which is entitled Operationalising Occupation. And it's called Operationalising because we have been talking a lot about occupation over the last few weeks and have been starting to think about how do we use that new knowledge and way of thinking about things. And operationalising is really trying to take that a step further. So how can we use the knowledge that we've got to put it into practice so that we can use it in a very concrete way in some ways. We've spent a lot of time talking about occupation, and one of the things we've done is put some boundaries around that, or tried to put some boundaries around that in terms of what is an occupation, what isn't occupation. I think we saw in the tutorials last week that that isn't always an easy thing to do, and as I said, based on the discussion, some of the literature, but also the discussion that I told you about in my Facebook page, there are people in the profession who agree and disagree with the idea that we can and should put boundaries around occupation. But nonetheless, it has been a central part of what we've talked about. What we've also talked about, and one of the things you really seem to have grasped, is the idea that occupations and people exist within a whole range of contexts or environments, is another way of thinking about them, and that the environments or contexts shape the occupation, but also the occupation shapes and influences the context. What we've also recognised, of course, is that we're talking about people doing all of this and people existing within environments. And so what I think we've got now is an idea that there are these three key components to thinking about humans as occupational beings and the relationship between occupation and health. And so now is a chance to take that just that little step further. It also fits into the discussion we have had about the structure of professional knowledge. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the paradigm, and we will continue to do that. You're doing a lot of work in other courses this semester, and you'll continue doing it in other fields that are related knowledge. So things that aren't central to OT, but are useful depending on where you're working and who you're working with. What we haven't done so much of is conceptual practice models, and that's really what this week's focus is on, and on one of those models in particular, although you'll get a taste of a few others. So that's where this fits in. We're talking about something that came from Canada, but has been used but is used around the world in a whole range of countries and settings, and it is now called the Canadian Model of Occupational Performance and Engagement. And this model is the latest version, the latest iteration and refinement of work that has been going on in Canada since, I think, the sort of late 80s, certainly the early 90s. And it started when the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists dedicated some time and resources to having a look at occupational therapy practice and seeing if there was some way of providing a shared language and a shared way of understanding what occupational therapy practice looked like in Canada. It has gone through a few versions, and there's a number of documents and guidelines and tools that have come out of that, which we'll talk about in due course. But this is the one I want to talk about this week, the Canadian Model of Occupational Performance and Engagement, or the CMOPE for short. This is a picture of the CMOPE, and not surprisingly, it's got those three components: person, environment, and occupation. One of the things that is unique and interesting about the Canadian model, which we'll talk a bit more about, is the idea that spirituality is central to the person, and we'll talk about that. The other thing that is important and picks up on some of the discussions we've been having and some of the discussions that have been happening on my Facebook page that I've been telling you about is, and you probably can't see it that well on this diagram, but trying to get across that all of those components, the three, the person, the environment, and occupation, are all interlinking and connecting. And so they're not separate, and they're trying to get that across by the way the yellow triangle goes into the green, and similar with the blue and the green, and so on and so forth. So the key is that all of those things are intertwined, and we can't easily separate them, although we are doing that, for now anyway. In terms of going through the components, the person then, the Canadians see as being the main components being affective, cognitive, physical, and spirituality. So affective is all those feeling components, emotional, interpersonal, intrapersonal. Physical is about the doing, so the sensory and the motor, so how we perceive in a physical sense what's going on around us, and how we make motor responses to that in terms of movement and other things, of course. And cognitive is about thinking. So, for example, perception, memory, and judgment, and how we use all of those to different degrees and in different ways in different occupations to think about what's going on. Spirituality, as I say, is at the centre and is unique in this framework compared to some of the other models that you will come across and you'll see in the chapter. So what is spirituality? It is something that we struggle to define, and what often happens is that people think about it in terms of being religious. And I think one of the important distinctions that we need to make is that it can be about being religious, whatever that means for people, but spirituality can also have a non-religious component to that, and there's a really good chapter and some work by Anita Unruh from Canada that has talked about this. So what is spirituality? One of the issues is we can't directly observe it, and often people have trouble finding the words to describe what we mean by spirituality. But just to give you a bit of a taste, some of the questions that tap into spirituality are things like, for example, what's my purpose in life? What's the right way to live? What are my obligations to others? And if you think about those questions, I'm sure you can see how, for some people, those questions are answered or informed by religion, but for other people, they're not, and they don't have to be. So spirituality is really important and is at the core, which is why it's in the centre of that framework of the model, is at the core of the person, and therefore is a really important component when thinking about what influences that person's occupational performance and engagement. In terms of the rest of it then, the environment, so they break the environment up into these 4 types of environments: physical, institutional, cultural, and social. Cultural is about the ethos, expectations due to different groups that we might belong to, and there could be a whole range of groups. That could be a cultural group, a ceremonial religious type group, it could be a sporting group even, it could be a whole range of things, but it's essentially about the expectations which are around because you belong to a particular group. Institutional are those societal institutions and practices, and so it's things like what's the political situation, what's the political environment within which we exist as individuals and communities, what are the laws of the land and how do they shape what we do, and also there might be financial things as well in terms of the way our society is structured in terms of the division of resources and etc. The physical environment, fairly straightforward, focusing on the natural and built surroundings, so nature, gardens, weather, all those sorts of things, but also the built environment, buildings, roads, etc. And clearly they have an impact on occupational performance and engagement, which we've talked a bit about. And then finally, the social environment, all those social relationships, patterns and groups, the people around us and how we interact with those, or how they shape the way we interact and engage in occupations. In terms of the occupations then, as we've talked about quite a bit already, the Canadians break it up into self-care, productivity and leisure. So self-care being those things that we do to look after ourselves, productivity being those things that we do to make a contribution to society or to a group, and leisure being those things that we do to fill time in a fun way, so often. One of the things that it is worth highlighting in terms of the CMOPE is, and this has been a change in language as it's developed over the last few decades, is this idea that it's the Canadian model of performance and engagement. And here they're just trying to get across the idea, which is significant because it used to be the Canadian model of occupational performance, but recognising that performance can often be seen as a very mechanistic, I'm completing a task or an occupation, and I start it and I finish it. Whereas engagement is trying to add in that sense that we become immersed in it, we are fully engaged, and we connect with it at a different level, and recognizing that occupations do have both of those components, a performance and engagement component. So trying to be a bit more holistic in terms of how we think about the experiences we have of occupations. So that's the Canadian model of occupational performance and engagement. One of the things in the chapter that you've got to read is just highlighting that there are, and you can see across the top of this table, I'm not going to go into detail, but there are other conceptual practice models. For example, the model of human occupation, MOHO, and the person, environment, occupational performance, POP, and there are others you'll see in the textbook. Just recognising that at some level, these are different, but also similar. They all pick up on the key aspects of person, environment, occupation, but they do them slightly differently. And so I've got a summary there, and you'll see a summary in the book chapter you've got as well, that they talk about these things in slightly different ways. But they're all common in that they have person, environment, and occupation.